In metaphysics, the different kinds or ways of being are called categories of being or simply categories. To investigate the categories of being is to determine the most fundamental and the broadest classes of entities. A distinction between such categories, in making the categories or applying them, is called an ontological distinction. Introduction. The categories of being, or simply, the categories, are defined as the highest classes under which all elements of being, whether material or conceptual, can be classified. These categories belong to the realm of philosophy, and the difference between categories and classes was described by the philosopher C.I. Lewis as that of a hierarchical tree or pyramid, where the most general categories, such as those of logic, are to be found at the top and the least general classes, such as species of animal, at the bottom. There are therefore two main areas of interest at the top of the tree: how being first divides into discrete or overlapping sub-entities, and at the bottom of the tree, how the different elements can be correlated into higher classes. The structure may consist of a simple list such as the one produced by Aristotle, or it may be composed of headings and subheadings such as the tables produced by Immanuel Kant. The elements of being are commonly seen as things, whether objects or concepts, but most systems will also include as elements the relations between the objects and concepts. The distinction is also made between the elements themselves and the words used to denote such elements. The word category itself is derived from the Greek kategorion, meaning to predicate, and therefore the categories may also be thought of as kinds of predicate which may be applied to any particular subject or element, and by extension to the concept of being itself. If we take any subject and with it form a sentence, the subject is, then, in a valid system of categorization, all the different things we can say about the subject should be classifiable under one of the categories within the system. Aristotle listed 10 categories, amongst which we find, for example, the 3 categories of substance, quality and quantity. In Heidegger's example, this is a house. It is both red and tall. The word house can be classified under substance, red, under quality, and tall, under quantity. The subject, the house, gathers around it what was called in the 19th century a colligation of concepts, or in the 20th century a bundle of properties, all of which serve to define the house. By extension, we can say that all being consists of nothing but substance, quality, quantity and the rest, because nothing else can be said of the subject. Categorization has raised many problems throughout the history of philosophy, including those of the number and types of category, how the categories interrelate with one another, and whether they are real in some way or just mental constructs. And to introduce the many different solutions that have arisen, it is worth considering the history of the categories in brief outline. Early development. The process of abstraction required to discover the number and names of the categories has been undertaken by many philosophers since Aristotle, and involves the careful inspection of each concept to ensure that there is no higher category or categories under which that concept could be subsumed. The scholars of the 12th and 13th centuries developed Aristotle's ideas, firstly, for example, by Gilbert of Poitiers, dividing Aristotle's 10 categories into 2 sets, primary and secondary, according to whether they inhere in the subject or not. Primary categories: substance, relation, quantity and quality. Secondary categories: place, time, situation, condition, action, passion. Secondly, following Porphyry's likening of the classificatory hierarchy to a tree, they concluded that the major classes could be subdivided to form subclasses. For example, substance could be divided into genus and species, and quality could be subdivided into property and accident, depending on whether the property was necessary or contingent. An alternative line of development was taken by Plotinus in the 2nd century, who by a process of abstraction reduced Aristotle's list of 10 categories to 5: substance, relation, quantity, motion and quality. Plotinus further suggested that the latter 3 categories of his list, namely quantity, motion, and quality correspond to three different kinds of relation, and that these three categories could therefore be subsumed under the category of relation. This was to lead to the supposition that there were only two categories at the top of the hierarchical tree, namely substance and relation. And if relations only exist in the mind, as many supposed, to the two highest categories, mind and matter, reflected most clearly in the dualism of René Descartes. Modern development and alternative conclusion, however, began to be formulated in the 18th century by Immanuel Kant, who realized that we can say nothing about substance except through the relation of the subject to other things. In the sentence, "This is a house," the substantive subject, house, only gains its meaning in relation to human use patterns or to other similar houses. The category of substance disappears from Kant's tables, and under the heading of relation, Kant lists inter alia the three relationship types of disjunction, causality and inherence. The three older concepts of quantity, motion and quality, as Peirce discovered, could be subsumed under these three broader headings, in that quantity relates to the subject through the relation of disjunction, motion relates to the subject through the relation of causality, and quality relates to the subject through the relation of inherence. Sets of three continued to play an important part in the 19th century development of the categories, most notably in G.W.F. Hegel's extensive tabulation of categories, and in C.S. Peirce's categories set out in his work on the logic of relations. One of Peirce's contributions was to call the three primary categories firstness, secondness and thirdness, which both emphasizes their general nature, and avoids the confusion of having the same name for both the category itself and for a concept within that category. In a separate development, and building on the notion of primary and secondary categories introduced by the scholastics, Kant introduced the idea that secondary or derivative categories could be derived from the primary categories through the combination of one primary category with another. This would result in the formation of three secondary categories. The first, community, was an example that Kant gave of such a derivative category. The second, modality, introduced by Kant, was a term which Hegel, in developing Kant's dialectical method, showed could also be seen as a derivative category, and the third, spirit, or will, were terms that Hegel and Schopenhauer were developing separately for use in their own systems. Karl Jaspers in the 20th century, in his development of existential categories, brought the three together, allowing for differences in terminology, as substantiality, communication and will. This pattern of three primary and three secondary categories was used most notably in the 19th century by Peter Mark Roget to form the 6 headings of his Thesaurus of English Words and Phrases. The headings used were the three objective categories of abstract relation, space and matter, and the three subjective categories of intellect, feeling and volition, and he found that under these 6 headings all the words of the English language, and hence any possible predicate, could be assembled. 20th century development. In the 20th century, the primacy of the division between the subjective and the objective, or between mind and matter, was disputed by, among others, Bertrand Russell and Gilbert Ryle. Philosophy began to move away from the metaphysics of categorization towards the linguistic problem of trying to differentiate between, and define, the words being used. Ludwig Wittgenstein's conclusion was that there were no clear definitions which we can give to words and categories, but only a halo, or corona, of related meanings radiating around each term. Gilbert Ryle thought the problem could be seen in terms of dealing with a galaxy of ideas, rather than a single idea, and suggested that category mistakes are made when a concept, understood as falling under one category, is used as though it falls under another. With regard to the visual analogies being used, Peirce and Lewis, just like Plotinus earlier, likened the terms of propositions to points, and the relations between the terms to lines. Peirce, taking this further, talked of univalent bivalent and trivalent relations linking predicates to their subject, and it is just the number and types of relation linking subject and predicate that determine the category into which a predicate might fall. Primary categories contain concepts where there is one dominant kind of relation to the subject. Secondary categories contain concepts where there are two dominant kinds of relation. Examples of the latter were given by Heidegger in his two propositions: the house is on the creek, where the two dominant relations are spatial location and cultural association, and the house is 18th century, where the two relations are temporal location and cultural quality. A third example may be inferred from Kant in the proposition, the house is impressive or sublime, where the two relations are spatial or mathematical, disposition and dynamic or motive power. Both Peirce and Wittgenstein introduced the analogy of color theory in order to illustrate the shades of meanings of words. Primary categories, like primary colors, are analytical, representing the furthest we can go in terms of analysis and abstraction, and include quantity, motion and quality. Secondary categories, like secondary colors, are synthetic and include concepts such as substance, community and spirit. Categorical distinctions. The common or dominant ways to view categories as of the end of the 20th century. Via bundle theory as bundles of properties, categories reflects differences in these. Via peer-to-peer comparisons or dialectics, categories are formed by conflict, debate. Via value theory as leading to specific ends, categories are formed by choosing ends. Via conceptual metaphors as arising from characteristics of human cognition itself, categories are found via cognitive science and other study of that biological system. Any of these ways can be criticized for seeking to make distinctions that aren't as universal as claimed, for serious bias in point of view, for relying on theological or spiritual claims a priori, for relying too much on surface conflict or current investigative priorities to point out differences, for ignoring action, for ignoring the perceived or biospheric context, or the cognitive mechanisms that perceive and invent categories, or for relying on a complex empirical process of investigation that is poorly understood and only recently embarked upon. In process philosophy, this last is the only possibility, but historically philosophers have been loath to conclude that nothing exists but process. Categorization of existence. As bundles of properties, bundle theory is an ontological theory about objecthood proposed by the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, which states that objects only subsist as a collection of properties, relations or tropes. In an epistemological sense, bundle theory says that all that can be known about objects are the properties which they are composed of, and that these properties are all that can be truly said to exist. For example, if we take the concept of a black square, bundle theory would suggest that all that can be said to exist are the properties of a black square. The properties of a black square are black, regular, and quadrilateral. However, from these properties alone, we cannot deduce any kind of underlying essence of a black square, or some object called a black square, except as a bundle of properties which constitute the object that we then go on to label as a black square. But the object itself is really nothing more than a system of relations of properties. To defend this, Hume asks us to imagine an object without properties. If we strip the black square of its properties, we end up reducing the object to non-existence. As formed by debate, intuition as evasion, a seemingly simpler way to view categories is as arising only from intuition. Philosophers argue this evades the issue. What it means to take the category physical objects seriously as a category of being is to assert that the concept of physical objecthood cannot be reduced to or explicated in any other terms, not, for example, in terms of bundles of properties, but only in terms of other items in that category. In this way, many ontological controversies can be understood as controversies about exactly which categories should be seen as fundamental, irreducible, or primitive. To refer to intuition as the source of distinctions and thus categories doesn't resolve this. ideology, dogma, and theory. Modern theories give weight to intuition, perceptually observed properties, comparisons of categories among persons, and the direction of investigation towards known specified ends. To determine what humanity in its present state of being needs to consider irreducible, they seek to explain why certain beliefs about categories would appear in political science as ideology, in religion as dogma, or in science as theory. As metaphors, a set of ontological distinctions related by a single conceptual metaphor was called an ontological metaphor by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who claimed that such metaphors arising from experience were more basic than any properties or symbol-based comparisons. Their cognitive science of mathematics was a study of the embodiment of basic symbols and properties, including those studied in the philosophy of mathematics via embodied philosophy, using cognitive science. This theory comes after several thousand years of inquiry into patterns and cognitive bias of humanity.